years. We know that they have been filled with meetings and partings. So many people have entered, and so many people have left our lives. We have known some people for a very long time, and others are of more recent vintage. Some we invited in, some were forced upon us. Some we cherished, others we disliked. Some proved to be blessings, others proved to be curses. Some made an impact, others did not. Some stayed long, others briefly. Some left by choice, some were taken. Some left temporarily and returned. Others departed forever. Some left with a prolonged goodbye. Some didn't bother to say goodbye. Some couldn't say goodbye. Some we were sorry to see go. Others we were glad to see go. Most we were indifferent to see go. Some are remembered. Most are forgotten. Some we thought were friends, but turned out to be mere acquaintances. Some were acquaintances, but turned out to be friends. Some helped us, others hindered us. Some we admired, and others we disdained. There were those who wished us the best in life, and there were those who really meant it. A few loved us unconditionally, while others attached strings. Some were demanding, and others were generous. Some were honest, others manipulative. Some taught us how to act. Some taught us how not to act. Some caused drama and upheaval. Others were pleasant and peaceful. Some filled us, others drained us. Some were faithful. Some proved to be faithless. Some we tried to hold on to for the wrong reasons, and others we tried to hold on to for the right reasons. I think of all the people I have known or met in this congregation over a long time. The presence of some has been constant, while many came and went. But amidst all these variables, there is one overarching commonality to all of our relationships. Everyone who comes into my life, and everyone who comes into your life, does so for a reason. And that reason is to test us, to test our compassion, to test our patience, and to test our generosity. Relationships test our compassion. 19th century author Ian McLaren wrote, "Let us be kind to one another, for most of us are fighting a hard battle." As a rabbi, I have sat with many who fought hard battles. Those battles may be with anxiety or sadness, with fear or regret, distance from a loved one, a failed this or a disappointing that, family fractures, professional upheavals, a chronic condition, a terrifying diagnosis, the end to possibilities. For some, Mortality whispers in their ear. For others, mortality breathes down their neck. Because we are engaged in these and other battles, we crave compassion. A cosmetic company advertised for pictures of and letters about the most beautiful woman in America. Among the thousands it received, one arrived from a boy who lived in a poor neighborhood. It read, "Let me tell you about the most beautiful woman in the world. She is my neighbor. I go to her house, bring in her newspaper, and walk her dog. We play checkers. We talk. She listens to me. She thinks I'm important. She says she's proud of me." The cosmetic company president read the letter and looked at the accompanying picture, whose caption read, "This shows you she is the most beautiful woman in America." But the cosmetic company president saw a lady with a few teeth, gray thin hair, deeply wrinkled skin, and a sallow complexion. He said, "We can't choose her as the most beautiful person in America because that proves our products are not necessary to be beautiful." No, we don't need cosmetics to be beautiful. We need compassion to be beautiful. Since God is called El Rachum, the compassionate one, we who are called on to emulate God must be compassionate to those created in His image. Next, relationships test our patience. One of the many travelers Abraham welcomed into his tent was an old man who was happy to accept all that Abraham offered. After he had bathed, rested, and eaten a bountiful meal, he opened his pack and took out his collection of idols and started praying to them. Abraham told them that it was the one God of Israel who had provided for all their needs. But the man would hear none of it. Abraham could not contain himself. Outraged, he drove the old man out of his tent and sent him on his way. Shortly after, God called to Abraham and asked, "Where is the old man?" Abraham shared with God what had transpired, as well as his anger and frustration at how, after receiving Abraham's generosity, the old man committed idolatry in Abraham's tent. To this, God rebuked Abraham, saying, "I put up with that man for 80 years, and you couldn't put up with him for one night." The Midrash describes God's daily activity. In the morning, God studies the Torah. In the afternoon, God brings couples together as the divine matchmaker. And in the evening, God administers the world and judges humankind. The Midrash tells us that upon entering the celestial courtroom, knowing the challenge before him, God utters a prayer. "May it be my will that my love for humanity overcomes my exasperation with them." And God has to recite this prayer daily, for the struggle with irksome people never ends. God continually prays for a heart filled with savlanut, patience, that will balance the daily frustrations that people supply. I know these vexations. I can barely tolerate the customer who engages in complex financial transactions ahead of me at the bank. Or the driver in the carpool lane who is traveling slower than drivers in the right-hand lane. Or the passenger next to me on the plane who takes my armrest as well as his. Or the people behind me at the ball game who talk through the entire 9 innings. And their conversation is not even interesting. People can be so annoying. In the Brothers Karamazov, Father Zosima laments the gap between loving humanity in general and disliking people in particular. He says, in my dreams, I often make plans to serve humanity, yet I am incapable of living in the same room with a person for 2 days. I know from experience that as soon as a person is near me, his personality disturbs me and restricts my freedom. In 24 hours, I begin to dislike the best of men. One because he takes too long over his dinner, another because he has a cold. I become hostile to people, he said, the moment they come close to me. Well, as another author wrote, love of humanity is easy because humanity does not surprise you with inconvenient demands. You never find humanity on your doorstep. In other words, we start out with gauzy visions of helping humankind, but people decline to cooperate. To see past someone's flaws, what the Talmud calls ma'avir al midotav, is hardly a natural instinct. If a person wronged us, then our inclination is to say goodbye and good riddance, at least until that person decides to eat crow and beg our forgiveness. The Talmud teaches it is the person able to overlook the shortcomings of his fellow who will be judged favorably by God. We beg of God, l'chol pshayim techaseh ba'ava, cover our sins with love. God forbid we prove incapable of extending to others the opportunity to start anew that we wish for ourselves. People test our patience. But since God is called erech hapayim, long-suffering, we who are called on to emulate God must be forbearing with those who try our patience. And then, relationships test our generosity. We all regularly judge people by yardsticks we could never measure up to ourselves. Mrs. Goldberg goes to a butcher to buy a chicken. She picks it up, shakes it, pinches it, smacks it, examines under its wings, looks into its eyes, puts it up to her nose. Not being able to stand anymore, the butcher says, Mrs. Goldberg, could you pass a test like that? Who could survive such a judgment? We are prone to justify our own misdeeds. But in turning on the infallible beam of our judgmental searchlight, we never consider granting that same consideration to others. We proclaim ourselves judge, jury, and sentencing agent, denying countless people the very due process that we would want for ourselves. But since we are all basar v'dam, flesh and blood, the extent of the gap between us and the person over whom we sit in judgment is not as large as we think. Some people deserve condemnation, but how often is our negative judgment the result of our being fault finders? A couple arrived home after High Holy Day services. The wife said, "Did you see what the woman in front of us wore to shul on our holiest night? Did you see the hairdo on the woman behind us? Did you see the jewelry on the woman sitting next to us?" The husband answered, "No. I was following the service and listening to the sermon." The wife said, "Well, a lot of good it does for you to go to temple." Even when God determined to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he descended to learn things firsthand. So often we are ungenerous because we only have one side of the story, and that from a distance. Jumping to conclusions seldom ends in happy landings. We must be humble in judgment, since it is the simple courtesy we want from others. But we are too eager to lament how we have been wronged, how others have failed us. They started it. They should be the first one to call. They should make amends. But doesn't each of us bear some responsibility for the condition of the relationships most dear to us? So we should judge a little less and understand a little more. We should give people a piece of our heart, not a piece of our mind. And we would do well to emulate the 18th century Rabbi Elimelech, who began his prayers, "May I see the good traits of others and not their defects." This is not only because we might well be mistaken, but because the other person, wrong as he or she may be, is still a human being created in the image of God. We need to judge people on the scale of merit, since that is exactly what we are here to ask God to do for us. And since God is called Notzer Chesed, dispenser of benevolence, we, who are called to emulate God, must be generous of spirit to those created in his image. Yes, there are people who have forfeited any claim to our compassion. Yes, there are people who have drained every drop from our reservoir of patience, no matter how vast. Yes, there are people whose selfishness has rendered them unworthy of our generosity. Yes, some people are unlikable, let alone unlovable. They are, though, far fewer than those who deserve our compassion, deserve our patience, and deserve our generosity, but who do not receive it because we are highly judgmental. Why are these tests that relationships bring so important? I have come to believe that everything we do and everything we say transcends the moment. Every act of compassion, every display of patience, and every deed of generosity produces effects we cannot know at the time, but produce effects they will. More and more, I see the wisdom of Rabbi Heschel's words. When I was young, I admired clever people. Now that I am older, I admire kind people. May we too admire such people. May we too be such people.